Picture the homecoming he had planned. 4-match greys on the long north road, a carriage polished like a promise, and on his arm as the towers of Blackmere Castle rose out of the November mist. A woman in sable-trimmed velvet who had spent the whole journey from London describing how she would rearrange the great hall for her first winter ball as its hostess. The Duke of Blackmere had rehearsed this arrival for weeks, the way weak men rehearse their boldest cruelties, and what he had rehearsed was this: the staff assembled on the steps, his wife somewhere above, pale and correct at a window, and Lady Vivienne Crane sweeping past them all into a house that would learn, by evening, who ruled it now. What he got instead was silence. No groom ran out for the horses. No light stood in the gatehouse. The great iron gates hung open on the dark drive like a question nobody was left to answer, and the lantern that had burned at that gate every night for 9 years, the lantern travellers on the North Road used to steer by, was out. The great hall, when he shoved the doors open himself because there was no footman to do it, was swept, orderly, cold as a church in January, and entirely empty, and on the long table where 400 years of Blackmere dukes had been toasted and mourned, there was one square of white. A letter. His name on it, in his wife's steady hand. And I will tell you just one line of it now. The line he read standing there in his travelling coat with his mistress's heels clicking to a baffled stop behind him. You will find the ledgers in order, the wages paid to Christmas, and the lantern out. If you have ever waited years for someone to notice you were the only thing holding their world upright, this story is for you. Tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight, and if you believe an empty house can say more than a courtroom, press subscribe before we go on, because you will want to be here when the rest of that letter is read. Now let us go back 9 years to where it truly began, to the morning a brewer's daughter first came up that same North Road and saw a lantern burning at a stranger's gate. Marianne Ellison was 20 when she married the Duke of Blackmere, and nobody on either side of the church pretended it was a love match. Her father, Thomas Ellison, had built the largest brewery in 3 counties out of 1 copper kettle and 40 years of 4 o'clock mornings. And what he had never been able to buy with any of it was the thing the hearts of Blackmere had owned for 4 centuries and could no longer afford to keep: a name. The old brewer got a Duchess for a daughter. The young Duke got the Ellison money to hold his creditors off the estate. And Marianne, who had been raised in rooms above a brewhouse where every man's wage was paid on time and every barrel honestly filled, got a castle so cold that the fires in the east wing were rationed like medicine, and a husband, Lucian Hart, who was handsome in the smooth unearned way of portraits, and who made it clear within the first season, with perfect politeness, that she had been purchased for a purpose the way one purchases a plough horse, and that the purpose did not include his company. The county called her the brewer's girl for the first year. They said the castle would smell of the mash tun by spring. They said it where she could hear it, at assemblies, behind fans that hid nothing, and were not intended to. And Marianne absorbed it the way she absorbed everything in those years, in silence, with her spine straight and her accounting private. Only one custom she carried up from her father's house and would not surrender. At the brewery gate, all her childhood, a lantern had burned every night of the year, because her father said a working house owed a light to anyone still on the road after dark. She had a lantern hung at the great gates of Blackmere her first month as its Duchess, and lit it herself most evenings, walking down the long drive in all weathers while the footman watched from the windows and did not yet understand her, and the North Road carriers came to know it, and then to bless it, and years later, when everything else in this story had burned down to what it truly was. That lantern was the one thing every soul in the county remembered kindly of Blackmere. She told herself in the beginning that she lit it for travellers. She admitted to herself only much later that she lit it, night after night for 9 years, for a husband who was always on some other road, so that whatever hour he came home, he would see that someone had waited. He rarely came home. He was polite at breakfast when he was there, and absent by supper more seasons than not. And Marianne filled the silence the way women of her rank were taught to fill it, except that she filled it differently, because a brewer's daughter cannot watch a great house rot around her and call the watching dignity. She learned the castle the way her father had learned his trade, cellar to roofline. She learned which chimneys drew and which wasted coal, which tenant farms flooded and why, which merchants padded their bills on the assumption that nobody at Blackmere read past the total. She learned the ledgers better than the steward who kept them, a smooth, deferential man named Mr. Silas Nash, who had a talent for numbers that balanced beautifully and explained nothing, and who spoke to her, when he had to speak to her, in the tone a man uses for a decorative object that has unaccountably learned to ask questions. She did not trust him. She could not have said at first exactly why, only that his accounts were like a room that has been tidied a moment before you entered it, and she began, quietly, in her own hand. In books Nash never saw, to keep a second set, a duplicate record of everything that crossed her sight, rents and repairs and wages and sales, because her father had taught her that the honest ledger is the one kept where the thief cannot reach it. She did not yet think of anyone at Blackmere as a thief. The habit was simply who she was. It would turn out, 9 years on, to be the whole war. The trouble, when it came, wore silk and was charming to everyone whose good opinion could be spent. Lady Vivienne Crane was the widow of a rich man who had died conveniently early, and she moved through London drawing-rooms with the confidence of a woman who had never once been refused anything she had taken the trouble to want. And in the Duke's 3rd year of marriage, she took the trouble to want him. It was not love. Even the gossips never insulted the word so far as to call it that. Lucien was a duke, and pliable and lonely in the particular way of vain men, which is to say lonely for applause rather than for company, and Vivienne applauded him with a skill his wife had never learned, because his wife had been busy keeping his roof from falling in. The London seasons grew longer. The letters home grew shorter, then stopped pretending, then stopped. Marianne noticed it the way she noticed everything, precisely and without theatre. She noticed the bills from a Bond Street jeweller for pieces she never received. She noticed the scent on his coats the 1 week a year he spent at Blackmere, orange flower and something sharper underneath, and she noticed the way the county smiles turned from mockery to pity, which was worse, and she said nothing, because she had watched other wives say something, and had seen how efficiently a crying woman is converted into an unstable one by men who need her to be wrong. She confronted only once, and not her husband. At the opera in the 3rd winter, she found herself beside Lady Vivienne at the interval, close enough that courtesy required words, And Marianne said, quietly, without heat, that she would not pretend ignorance and did not expect shame, but that the man in question came with a castle full of people whose wages depended on him remembering he owned it, and she would be obliged if Vivienne wrung him out no harder than his estates could bear. Vivienne had looked at her for a long, delighted moment, the way a cat looks at something small that has surprised it by speaking, and said that she now understood why Lucian never spoke of his wife, since there was evidently nothing in her a man could boast of at cards. And Marianne had inclined her head as though accepting a compliment and gone back to her seat, and if her hands shook on her fan for the length of the second act, the lamps were low, and nobody saw. What she did the next morning was not weep. What she did was call on the Dowager Duchess Agatha, her husband's grandmother, a fortress of a woman who had frightened 3 generations of hearts and had never once addressed Marianne with anything warmer than accuracy, and lay before her, without a single word about Mistresses, the previous quarter's accounts, and ask the old woman to explain, if she could, why the Blackmere pearls, which by the marriage settlement were to pass to the next Duchess, had been sent to London for cleaning in June and had not come back. The Dowager read the page. Then she read Marianne, which took longer and appeared to be the more instructive of the two. "He is his father again," she said at last, "and his father nearly ended us. What do you want of me, girl?" And Marianne said the first fully honest thing she had said aloud in 3 years. "I want a witness." The pearls came back to the Blackmere vault within the month, recalled by a letter from the Dowager that Marianne never read and could imagine perfectly, and from that day the 2 women, who never once discussed affection and would both have been embarrassed by the word, were allies, which in that family was the stronger bond. The years that followed were the years the county later refused to believe it had watched without seeing. The Duke lived in London, on money that came from somewhere, and at Blackmere the somewhere was Mr. Silas Nash's ledgers, which balanced more beautifully every quarter and explained less. Marianne's duplicate books told a different story, told it slowly, entry by entry, the way rot tells its story in a beam. Rents recorded once and banked twice. Repairs invoiced for cottages that stood unrepaired in sums that would have rebuilt them in oak. A charge, recurring, discreet, for the lease of a house in Half Moon Street that no one at Blackmere had ever slept in, and that Marianne, through the plainest inquiry in the world, a letter from her solicitor Mr. Penrose to the leaseholder's agent, learned was occupied by Lady Vivienne Crane. Her husband's mistress was being kept, in part on the tenants' rents, on the wages of laundry maids, on the coal that was rationed in the East Wing while she, the Duchess of Blackmere, sat doing the sums by 1 candle because the household books could no longer honestly afford 2. She sat with that discovery for a long evening, and what she felt, she was surprised to find, was not chiefly grief. Grief had been paid out already, in instalments, over years. What she felt was the thing her father felt when a cooper sold him green staves for seasoned. The cold, orderly anger of an honest tradesman who has finally seen the invoice for what it is. And what she did was what he would have done. She did not scream, she did not write to London. She took a fresh book, ruled a line, and began at the top of the page, dates, sums, sources, witnesses, building the account of it as though it would one day be audited, because some quiet part of her had already understood that one day it would. The winter that decided everything arrived with a letter that was not even addressed to her. It came in February from the Duke to Mr. Nash, and Nash, whose contempt for the Duchess had grown careless with years of success, left it where a housekeeper with sharper eyes and older loyalties found it and carried it upstairs folded in a linen count. Mrs. Pemble had kept Blackmere's keys for 30 years, had watched Marianne light the gate lantern in sleet, and had formed her opinions. The letter instructed Nash to have the state apartments aired, the gold service polished, and the household made ready to receive, at Easter, Lady Vivienne Crane, who would be coming north as his Grace's guest, for a stay of no fixed term, and who was to be given, the phrase was underlined, every courtesy due the mistress of the house. Every courtesy due the mistress of the house. Marianne read the sentence 3 times, standing by the one candle, and understood that it meant exactly what it said. He was not hiding her any more. He was importing her. The wife would remain, presumably, somewhere in the fabric of the building, like the tapestries, like the damp, a fixture his guests would be too polite to mention, while the woman kept on the tenant's rent sat at the foot of his table and rang for Marianne's servants with Marianne's bell. She set the letter down and found that her hands were perfectly steady, and that surprised her, until she understood the reason for it. Somewhere in the years of waiting, without ever admitting it, she had finished. The lantern had gone on burning at the gate out of habit and discipline, but the person it burned for had stopped existing, and this letter was merely his obituary. She did not cry that night. She sat until the candle died, and made, in the dark, in the orderly silence of her own head, a plan with the shape of a brewery ledger, and in the morning she began to execute it, unhurried, item by item, the way her father filled an order for a customer he did not intend to serve again. It took her 7 weeks. And the marvel of it, the thing the county could never afterward get over, was that she did it in plain sight, and nobody saw. She paid the household's wages forward to Christmas out of the year's dairy and orchard money. Every maid, every groom, every laundry woman entered and receipted in the estate book in her own hand, because a brewer's daughter does not leave working people hostage to a gentleman's chaos. She had the linen counted, the plate inventoried, the cellars listed, and signed each schedule like a tenant handing back a farm in good heart. She wrote to Mr. Penrose in the market town and had him come up on a quiet Tuesday, and what she gave him was the work of 6 years, her duplicate ledgers, every false invoice traced, every double-banked rent, every half-moon street charge, sealed in oilcloth with her instructions on the wrapper in a firm round hand, to be opened when someone finally asks the right question. And not before. She withdrew from a bank in her father's old town where Nash had no correspondent, the one sum on earth that was entirely hers, her mother's legacy. £400 in consols that had sat untouched through 9 years, because touching it had felt, until now, like giving up. And she told nobody anything, except that on the last Sunday of March, after church, Mrs. Pemble asked leave to speak, shut the door of the still room behind her, and said, in the voice of a woman who has rehearsed and discarded 40 gentler versions, that she was too old to learn to curtsy to a kept woman, that Kello, the butler and the cook and the head groom and 11 others were of the same mind, and that whatever her Grace was quietly preparing for, and she would not insult her Grace by pretending not to have noticed the inventories, they wished to give notice accordingly, and to ask, respectfully, where she was going. Marianne looked at this woman who had never once called her the brewer's girl, and made the only unplanned decision of the whole campaign. "North," she said. "There is a coaching inn at Calder Bridge on the Carrier Road, closed these 2 years since the old landlord died. I have bought the lease of it. It has good cellars, a broken roof, and no staff at all. The wages will be honest and the work will be real, and anyone who comes had better come for that and not for loyalty, because loyalty does not mend slates." Mrs. Pemble was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had been mending Blackmere's slates, one way and another, for 30 years, and asked what day the wagons left. They left on the 8th of April, before light. 2 hired carriers' wagons carrying 14 people, their boxes, and not one object that was not theirs or hers. And the county, which slept through it, spent years afterward inventing the spectacle it had missed, a duchess in the dark, in a plain brown travelling cloak, on the seat of a brewer's wagon. What is true is this. The night before, alone, Marianne walked the long drive one last time, and stood before the gate lantern she had lit with her own hands upward of 3,000 times, and looked at it burning its faithful yellow light down the empty north road. And then she opened the little glass door and blew it out, and the dark that came down was enormous and clean, like an account ruled off. And then she went in, and by the light of the last candle she would ever burn in that house, she wrote the letter, and left it on the great hall table, square in the middle, where 400 years of hearts had toasted their luck, and went to bed and slept. She would tell someone years later, better than she had slept since her wedding. Now you know what the Duke did not. That morning in November 7 months after, when the carriage with the 4 matched greys came up the north road at last. He had stayed away through spring and summer, first because London was pleasant, then because a vague unease had begun arriving in his mail, letters from Nash grown oddly thin, a note from his grandmother he did not finish reading, and a man of his sort answers unease the way he answers a creditor, by being out. He came in November because Vivienne insisted. She wanted her winter ball, she wanted the state apartments and the gold service, she wanted, though she did not put it this way, to be paraded, and so he came home to parade her, up the long dark drive where no lantern burned, past the unmanned gatehouse, to the door no footman opened, into the swept and freezing hall where his name waited on the table in his wife's hand. He read it with his hat still on. Vivienne's heels clicked to a stop somewhere behind him, and her voice, for the first time in their acquaintance, lost its music. Where, she asked, were the servants? He did not answer, because he was reading, and I will give it to you now, the whole of it, as it was later read aloud in rather different company, because Marianne kept a copy, being her father's daughter, and it was, like everything she ever set her name to, exact, to his Grace the Duke of Blackmere. You will find the ledgers in order, the wages paid to Christmas, and the lantern out. The linen, plate, and cellars are inventoried, and the schedules signed, on the table in the estate office with the keys. I have taken the staff who chose to give notice, my mother's legacy, which was never in your settlements, and my own clothes. You may have the inventories checked at your leisure. You will find that in 9 years I have taken nothing else, and you may notice, though I no longer expect it, that in 9 years I gave everything else. I have paid your people because they should not starve for your holidays. I have not paid your steward. Ask Mr. Nash, when next the 2 of you are settling accounts about Half Moon Street, and watch, I beg you, his face while he answers. since you have never once in 9 years watched mine. I stopped waiting for you on the night you cannot remember, because you were not there, and there is no reason you should remember it. It was a night like the other 3,000. I waited through all of them. I am done. Do not look for me. The lantern at the gate is out, and I have learned at some cost that a light left burning for a man who never once steered by it is not devotion. It is waste, and I was raised never to waste. The wages are paid to Christmas. After that, they are your own concern, as I am no longer. Marianne, no title. Just the name her mother gave her, at the bottom of the coldest and most orderly letter ever left on that table, and the Duke of Blackmere stood in his freezing hall and read it twice while his mistress went from room to echoing room upstairs, and what he felt first, to his lasting shame, and he did later own it, publicly, which is the one thing this story will allow him, was not loss. It was fear. Because a man who has never once read his own ledgers knows, in his marrow, the moment the person who read them for him is gone. What happened at Blackmere in the months that followed had the grim comedy of a machine running itself to pieces exactly as its departed engineer had calculated it would. Lady Vivienne lasted 11 days. An empty castle, it transpired, was not a possession but a sentence. There was no cook to dazzle, no housemaids to command, no county families calling, since the county, whose sympathies had swung to the vanished Duchess with the speed of people relieved to finally know which way to feel, returned her cards unanswered. She stood it until the fires smoked in the state apartments nobody knew how to air, and then she removed to the George in the market town, and from the George within the fortnight to London, and her letters to the Duke across that winter make a small cold study all their own, beginning in endearments, proceeding to requirements, and ending by February in the unadorned arithmetic of a woman calculating whether the position she had spent 4 years securing still existed to be held. It did not, and she knew it before he did, because she had always read him more accurately than he read anything. The Duke, alone in the wreck of his own homecoming, did at last the thing 9 years of comfort had spared him. He opened the books. He sat in the estate office where his wife's signed schedules lay squared on the table, keys atop them like a verdict, and he began to read slowly, badly, a man spelling out a language he had paid others to speak for him, and even his reading, even Lucian Hart's reading, could see that the accounts Mr. Nash laid smoothly before him did not match the world outside the window. The shuttered lodges, the tenant roofs gone green with moss, the home farms heard half what the ledger swore it was. He remembered then, because fear is a great aid to memory, the line in the letter he had been instructed to remember. Ask Mr. Nash about Half Moon Street and watch his face while he answers. He asked, and Silas Nash, who had grown rich on the certainty that this particular question would never come from this particular man, answered smoothly that Half Moon Street was a London accommodation kept for his Grace's own convenience. And his face while he said it did something small and swift at the corner of the mouth. And the Duke of Blackmere, who had never in his life watched anyone attentively except in a mirror, watched it happen, and understood in one vertiginous drop that his wife had told him the exact truth about everything, always, and that everyone else in his employ had been telling him something else. What he did next was the first competent act of his adult life, and it is a bitter compliment to Marianne that even this was her doing. He did what her letter had taught him to do, and went looking for the person who kept the honest ledger where the thief could not reach it. He found Mr. Penrose, or rather, he presented himself at Penrose's office in the market town, hat literally in hand, and asked whether his wife had left anything behind that might help a man discover how much had been stolen from him, and Penrose, a dry small man who had been savouring this conversation in prospect for half a year, replied that he held a parcel he was instructed to open when someone finally asked the right question, and that in his professional judgment his Grace had just asked it. But the unsealing did not happen in that quiet office, because by then the matter had outgrown quiet offices. The Blackmere debts, unpaid since Christmas because Nash had spent the winter quietly emptying what remained, had been called in a body, and the county bank convened a meeting of creditors in the assembly room above its own premises, the same room where the county's better families had once said brewer's girl behind their fans, and it was there, before the bankers and the merchants and the assembled gentry of 3 parishes, with Nash present in his best coat and the Duke present in his shame, that the oilcloth parcel was cut open and Marianne Ellison's 6 years of quiet bookkeeping were laid on the table in her firm round hand. Penrose read them into the room for 2 hours. He read the double-banked rents farm by farm, year by year, each entry cross set against Nash's official figure. He read the repair invoices for cottages whose tenants, several of them seated at the back of the room in their Sunday clothes, could testify had never seen a workman. He read the Half Moon Street lease, its quarterly charges initialed SN and its occupant named, and at that name the room made a sound like weather changing, because half of them had dined with Lady Vivienne Crane at the Duke's London table and were recalculating those dinners course by course. And he read, last, the wrapper's inscription aloud, to be opened when someone finally asks the right question, and let the room sit with what it meant. That the Duchess they had condescended to for 9 years had seen the whole architecture of the theft, documented it beyond argument, provided against the ruin of the innocent, and then walked out of the county rather than spend one more winter begging its principal gentleman to look at what she was holding. The magistrates took Nash before the week was out. The trial that autumn was brief, the evidence being in the nature of arithmetic, and Silas Nash was convicted of forgery and systematic fraud and transported, and it was observed that not one soul in 3 parishes came forward to speak to his character, though several had been pleased to shoot his master's birds for a decade. The creditors, with the true accounts before them, proved less ruinous than the panic had promised. What the thief had taken was gone. But what remained, honestly reckoned, could be nursed, and the bank, guided by Penrose and by the Dowager Duchess Agatha, who arrived at the second meeting in black silk and sat at the front like a monument to make certain her grandson signed everything he was. Told to sign imposed terms that saved the tenant's holdings entire and reduced the Duke of Blackmere to the income of a modest squire for 15 years. The London house was sold, the 4 matched greys were sold, the gold service that Vivienne never got to preside over was sold, and it was at the sale of the London house that Lady Vivienne Crane's last letter arrived, regretting that circumstances now made impossible a connection she would always treasure, and announcing in the same paragraph her engagement to a nabob of the East India interest, a man 20 years older and immeasurably richer, whom she married that spring with the same precision she brought to everything, and if you are waiting for her punishment, this is all of it. And it was enough She got forever exactly what she had always wanted, and nothing else. Money, position, and the company of people who wanted her for precisely what she wanted them for. There are sentences that read like rewards until you have to live inside them. But the Duke stood up at that creditors' meeting before the reading was done, and this must be told fairly, because the county talked of it for 20 years. He rose while his own disgrace was still being entered into the minutes, and asked leave to speak, and the room, expecting the defence gentleman of his sort a bread to give, the injured innocents, the blame laid smoothly on the absent, went silent to enjoy it. He said instead, "Everything read to you today in my wife's hand is true, and I will contest none of it. The theft is Nash's, the ruin is mine. For 9 years the only person at Blackmere who did her whole duty was the woman I married for her father's money and never once thanked for her own worth, and she kept my house, my tenants, and my honour while I spent her dowry on my vanity in London. And she paid my servants' wages out of her orchards before she left, because she knew I would not think of them. You have heard her books. I ask you to weigh, as I now have to, what kind of woman keeps books like those for a man like me, and what kind of man required her to. That is all." And he sat down. It changed nothing material. The terms were the terms, but the county, which had needed 9 years to see Marianne and 9 minutes to convict her husband, discovered that his sentence had somehow, in that speech, become the harder one to watch served, because there is no colder cell than understanding, arrived too late, with the door standing open and nobody left to forgive you. But this story has run ahead of its own heroine, because while a county was learning at last to say her name correctly, Marianne Ellison was 200 miles north, with a broken roof over her head, and the first honest work of her life in front of her. And hers is the half of the story the ballads got right. Calderbridge was a carrier's town, a place of wagon yards and warehouse lofts, where 3 roads met at a stone bridge older than anybody's title, and the inn she had bought the lease of, sight mostly unseen, stood at the meeting of those roads, and had stood empty for 2 years. Its yards silted with leaves, its cellars flooded, its sign gone from the bracket, so that even its old name had faded out of local memory. The wagons from Blackmere came into that yard at dusk on the 3rd day, 14 tired people and a Duchess in a brown cloak, and Mrs. Pemble would tell the story every Christmas for the rest of her life, how her Grace climbed down, stood in the wreck of the yard in the last light, looked the place over from cobbles to chimneys exactly the way she had once looked over a dishonest ledger, and said, "Cellars first. A house that cannot keep its beer dry cannot keep anything." And they laughed, 14 exiles in a strange county, and went to work. She worked the way her father had worked, first in and last out, and she spent her mother's £400 the way capital ought to be spent and almost never is. Every shilling visible, the roof releaded, the cellars drained and floored, the great kitchen's range rebuilt, the stables restored stall by stall because a carrier's inn lives or dies by its stabling, and the yard relayed so wagons could turn in the wet. She hired local men and paid them Saturday noon, on the nail, in coin, and in a town where wages had a way of arriving late and short, that single habit did more for her name than a herald could have. They did not know she was a duchess. She called herself Mrs. Ellison, a widow of the brewing trade, which was, as she said privately to Mrs. Pemble, 2/3 true and the remaining third dead to her anyway, and if the 14 who had followed her knew better, they had all, without one word being agreed among them, arrived at the same fierce silence on the subject. The inn wanted a name, the old one being past recovering. It was the head groom who asked her, the morning the new sign bracket went up, what should be painted on the board, and Marianne stood in the yard a long moment with her arms folded, and then said, 3 lanterns. One for the road that brings you, one for the road that takes you, and one burning whether you come or go at all. And so it was painted, 3 yellow lanterns on a black ground, and so it was lit, because she carried her father's custom to her own gate now. 3 lamps burning at the yard arch every night of the year, visible half a mile down all 3 roads, and the carriers, who are the fastest gossips in England and the best judges of an honest house, began to steer by them within the season. The 3 lanterns at Calder Bridge, clean straw, dry cellars, full weight, fair reckonings, and a landlady who could tally a waybill faster than any clerk on the road, and who would carry a bowl of broth to a wet postboy with her own hands. By the first winter the yard was full most nights. By the second, the wool factors and the cattle drovers had made it their settling house, because word had gone down the roads that Mrs. Ellison's arithmetic could be trusted with other men's money, and she found herself, almost without intending it, keeping the informal exchange of 3 trades, her long table at quarter days covered in other people's ledgers, her opinion asked and taken, her inn become what a castle had never once managed to be in 9 years, which is to say a place people were glad to arrive at. It was a carrier who first spoke to her of Daniel Mercer in the way of the roads where every name arrives with its freight bill attached. Mercer's wagons ran the length of the North Road and 2 roads besides, 40 teams. A man who had begun at 12 as a wagon boy and owned his line before he was 30, hard in a bargain, soft with his horses, and honest, the carrier said, to the point of inconvenience. She met him the following quarter day when he came in person about winter stabling for his teams, a big, quiet man in a plain drab coat with no rings and no flourish, who looked over her stable stall by stall before he said one word about terms, and then offered a fair price without haggling and shook on it, and looked at her afterward with a directness nobody had aimed at her in years, and said that his drivers spoke of this house as men speak of a good harbour, and that he could see they had reported it truly. He took to stopping at the 3 lanterns whenever his rounds allowed, and it would be a tidy lie to say that either of them courted, because what they did for a full year was talk freight rates, feed schedules, the scandal of turnpike trusts, and the right way to season an axle, and neither of them was fooled for a minute, and neither of them hurried. He was the first man in her life who asked her opinion assuming it would be worth more than his own, and the first who, when she gave it, acted on it. And she watched for the flinch, the little masculine wince she had learned to expect when she was right in company, and it never came. He only nodded, slow, filing it, and once said, entirely without gallantry, that if she ever tired of innkeeping his line, wanted a head of accounts, and he doubted he could afford her. She laughed. Mrs. Pemble, passing with a tray, nearly dropped it, because in 30 years of service she had heard her Grace laugh like that exactly never. It was on a wet October evening in the 2nd year that the North brought her its news, in the natural way of an inn, in the mouths of travellers. A wool factor from the south, settling his account, mentioned the great scandal of the season down his way, a Duke's steward taken for forgery on the evidence of the runaway Duchess's own secret account books, left sealed with a lawyer if you please, like a mine under the whole scheme. And the Duke ruined and standing up in the creditors' meeting to shame himself before the county, and the mistress skipped off to marry an India merchant, and the wife never found to this day, though there was talk of a reward. The long room chattered over it agreeably, the way rooms do over other people's counties, and Mrs. Ellison of the Three Lanterns wiped down her table and heard the whole of her own life discussed by strangers who could not have imagined the landlady was the mine, and said only, when the factor asked her opinion of such a wife, that ledgers were like lanterns, no use to anybody kept dark, and moved down the table, and that night, alone, she read the one letter Penrose had sent her through the whole affair, asking whether she wished to appear, to claim, to answer, to return. She wrote back 4 lines. The books know everything I know. The wages were paid to Christmas. See that the bank honours the tenant's terms. I claim nothing but my mother's name, which I am using. I will not come back. It was Daniel Mercer who told her, without knowing he was doing it, the one thing about her old life she had never known, and it undid her more thoroughly than any of the Gramblowes had managed. They were at her long table on a winter evening, the accounts between them and the inn quiet, and he was talking idly of the roads as he always did. And he said that her 3 lanterns put him in mind of a light his drivers used to bless on the southern runs years back, a single lamp at a castle gate on the North Road, miles from any town, that burned every night of the year in all weathers, and the men had a name for it on the road. They called it the Duchess's lamp, and steered the last dark miles by it, and told their new boys, when they asked, that some great lady lit it with her own hands for no profit to herself, only so that working men on the road at night would know somebody in that cold country was thinking of them. It went out some years back, Mercer said, and the runs feel longer without it, and my old drivers still speak of it the way you'd speak of a good man dead. And then he stopped, because his landlady, the steadiest pair of hands on 3 roads, was sitting very still with tears running down her face, the first anybody at Calderbridge had ever seen from her, and being the man he was, he did not exclaim, and did not apologize, and did not reach for her. He sat quiet a moment, and then said slowly, the way he filed her opinions, "It was yours. All those years, on the other end of that light, it was you." That is where she told him. All of it, the name, the castle, the 9 years, the letter on the table, told plainly and without decoration across her own ledgers by a woman who had never once told it whole, even to herself, and Daniel Mercer listened the way he checked a stable, thoroughly, missing nothing. And when it was finished, he was silent for a long while, and then he said the sentence that Mrs. Pemble, who was not above a keyhole in a good cause, repeated at every christening for 20 years after. He said, "I have steered by your light without knowing your name, and I have known your worth without knowing your rank, and I find nothing in tonight's accounts that changes my terms." And Marianne, who understood a closed bargain when she heard one, put out her hand, and he shook it, and that, at the 3 Lanterns, was the whole of the proposal, and neither of them ever felt short-changed of romance. Because what is romance, rightly reckoned, but being seen accurately and wanted anyway? There was one disclosure still owed at that table, and he made it the same night, awkwardly, going red like a wagon boy, that his uncle was Viscount Fernley, childless, old, and that the title and its mortgaged acres would land on him whether he consented or not, and that he had kept it quiet all his working life, because he had watched what the expectation of a title did to men's honesty around him, and had once, years ago, been courted almost to the altar by a lady who proved, when his uncle's health briefly improved, to have been courting the reversion rather than the man. "So I am telling you the worst of it now," he said. "You may be a viscountess yet, and I am sorry for it." And Marianne laughed until the tears came back for the second time in one evening. Because of all the men in England, she had contrived to accept the only one who confessed a title the way other men confess a debt. She told him it changed nothing, and it is the plain record of both their lives that it never did. The Duke of Blackmere came north in the spring. He came alone, on horseback, without servants, which was no longer entirely by choice. And the manner of his finding her was the manner of everything now. Other people's roads leading where his own had failed, a carrier's remark overheard in an inn-yard, a landlady at Calderbridge, North Country, keeps 3 lamps burning and reckons like a counting-house, and they say she came from the south with half a castle's staff at her back. He knew before he saddled the horse. He told himself for 200 miles that he was going to settle accounts, to bring her the deed of separation to sign, to do the decent orderly thing, and all of that was true the way his life had always been true. Which is to say, it was the paper over the actual thing. And the actual thing was that he had spent a year and a half in an empty castle where every corridor ended in her absence, and he could not die without seeing what she had built instead of him. He reached Calderbridge at dusk and saw the 3 lanterns come on above the arch while he sat his tired horse across the road, lit by a girl in an apron who did it exactly as his wife had once done it. Unhurried, attending to the flame, and he watched travellers turn in under the lights to a sound he had never once heard at Blackmere in 9 years. The sound of a full house that is glad, and he understood, sitting there in the dark that no lamp anywhere was lit for, most of what there was to understand, before he ever crossed the yard. She received him. That should be recorded. She did not have him turned away, though the yard would have done it at one word, and half of it recognized him, and stood very still, and Kello the butler, now the lantern cellarman, placed himself inside the tap-room door with a wagon spoke in his hand, and stood there for the duration on general principles. She took him to the small settling room where the factors did their business, and gave him the good chair by the fire, because he looked, she said afterward, like a man who had ridden through his own ghost to get there. And she sat across her own table from him, with her hands folded and waited, which was the one skill her marriage had perfected. What he had brought he laid on the table, the deed of separation, generous past her asking on every point that remained his to be generous with. And what he said, when the papers were done, and there was nothing left to hide behind, was not the speech from the creditors' meeting, which the county had told and retold until it reached even Calderbridge. She stopped him when he began it, saying she had heard it second-hand, and it had been well enough said the first time. What he said instead, at the end, standing with his hat in his hands in a room that smelled of ink and beeswax and other people's honest business, was smaller and truer, and she never repeated it to anyone but Daniel. He said, "I read your letter every night for a year before I understood it. I thought it was an accounting. It was a mercy. You told me the one thing no one else would have told me, where the theft was, and you told it to a man who had given you no reason to spare him ruin. I have not come to ask for anything. There is nothing in that house I could ask you to come back to. I emptied it long before you left it. I came so that one time in my life I would look at you and see you." and say so, and go. And Marianne looked at him, the smooth, unearned face grown lined at last into something almost like a countenance, and found that the anger was not there any more. Not because it had been forgiven away, but because it had been outgrown, the way the inn had outgrown the castle. And she said the words this channel's faithful will know she had been owed the saying of for 11 years. You were not. There to be told, Lucian, all 9 years, everything you learned from my letter stood open in the estate books for any man who troubled to look. I did not hide the truth from you. You declined to visit it. She rose then and gave him her hand briefly, as one gives it to a departing guest, and said that supper in the tap-room was at 7, that his room would be the blue one over the arch, that his money was refused, once, plainly, and that he would leave in the morning fed and rested, because no traveller left the Three Lanterns otherwise, whatever his sins. And the Duke of Blackmere ate his supper that night in the warm, crowded room among carriers and drovers who did not lower their voices for him, under the lights his wife had lit, in the house his wife had raised, served kindly and charged nothing, like any other man benighted on the road, which was, of all the justices arrived at in this story, the most exact, not cast out, not taken back. Made ordinary. He left at first light, and the record of the rest of his life is brief, and, in its reduced way, honourable, which is more than the first 40 years had promised. He went back to Blackmere and lived in 6 rooms of it, kept 2 servants where 40 had idled, and worked, actually worked, at the nursing of the estate, riding his own boundaries the way she once had. Learning his own ledgers at 50 like a schoolboy at his letters, and paying down year by year, ahead of the bank's schedule, the fund the creditors had settled on the tenants, so that in time the cottages Nash's invoices had lied about were mended in fact, every one, and paid for out of the Duke's own shrunken purse, a penance he never spoke of and never missed a year of, and which fooled nobody into forgetting anything, and was kept up anyway, because it was, as he told his grandmother once, the one useful thing left within his power. The Dowager Duchess Agatha lived to a great age, as such women do, and said of her grandson at the end that ruin had been the making of him, which was as near to tenderness as she came in 90 years. And one custom more he kept, and the North Road kept his secret badly, so that in time the whole county knew it, and had the wit, for once, to say nothing. Every evening of his life, in all weathers, the Duke of Blackmere walked down his long dark drive to the great gates, and lit, with his own hands, the lantern his wife had lit for 9 years, and stood a moment, and walked back alone. He understood, no man better, that the light called nobody home. The person it had waited for was housed and happy 200 miles north, and the person who now lit it deserved no traveller's blessing. He lit it anyway. Ask any carrier on that road what the lamp at Blackmere gates meant in those years, and you would get the same answer, that it was the Duke's lamp now, and it burned not to bring anyone back, but so that the man who lit it should never once be allowed to forget what used to stand there. And if there is a colder discipline a man can set himself every dusk of his remaining life, the roads never heard of it. He wrote to her once, years on, when word of her second wedding travelled south. Not to protest, the deed was long done and the church satisfied and the lawyers paid. It was 1 page. It said that he had heard she was married, and that he had made inquiries, being past pride, and learned what manner of man Daniel Mercer was, and that it eased something in him to know it, and that he regretted, of everything, not the mistress, who had merely been the shape his vanity took, but the 10,000 ordinary evenings on which he might have walked down his own drive and stood beside her while she lit the lamp, and had not thought it worth his boots. Wherever you are reading this, the letter ended, there is a light at my gate that I keep for the instruction of the man who put it out. Be well, Marianne. It is the last line of his that survives. She read it once, at her own table, folded it and put it in the drawer of her writing desk beside her copy of the letter she had left on his, the two of them lying together like a debt and its receipt. And she did not answer it, not out of cruelty, but because she had said everything she owed him on a November table years before, and a woman who keeps honest books does not pay the same account twice. Some doors, she told Mrs. Pemble, who had watched her read it and said nothing, are kinder left shut than opened for one last politeness. And she went down to see to the evening's wagons, and that was the whole of her mourning for the Duke of Blackmere. And it was enough. And it was exact. She and Daniel Mercer were married at Calder Bridge in the spring, in the plain stone church by the bridge, and the wedding was everything her first had not been, which is to say, small, loud, and true. The yard of the Three Lanterns was cleared for the wedding dinner, and the trestles ran the length of it, drovers and factors and post-boys and the 14 exiles of Blackmere at the head of the table, Mrs. Pemble weeping steadily and denying it, Kello proposing the toast with the wagon, spoke laid ceremonially on the table before him, in memory, he said, of the one night it had nearly been needed. The old Viscount Fernley, too frail to travel, sent his carriage anyway, empty, as a courtesy, and the sight of a viscount's carriage following a brewer's daughter from church behind 40 carriers' wagons hung with harness bells was, all agreed, the finest thing seen on the North Road in living memory. And the Dowager Duchess Agatha, who could not with any propriety attend the remarriage of her grandson's former wife, and had never in her life let propriety stop a thing she wished to do, sent a small package with a single line in her upright hand. The pearls stay with the name, which is the name's loss. This was my own mother's, and goes where the worth went. Inside was a plain gold ring set with one garnet, worn thin with 200 years of hands, and Marianne wore it to the end of her life. The rest is prosperity, which makes short telling, because happiness keeps thin ledgers. The Three Lanterns became 3 inns, then a 4th, spaced along the carrier roads a day's haul apart, each with its 3 lamps at the arch. And Mercer's line and Marianne's houses grew into one concern so trusted on the northern roads that its waybills passed like banknotes. And when the old Viscount died at last, the title landed on Daniel exactly as threatened, and the new Viscountess Fernley went on standing behind her own bar on quarter days, tallying drovers' accounts with a garnet ring on her finger. And if any traveller was fool enough to raise an eyebrow at a Viscountess in an apron, the room educated him before she needed to. They had 2 children. The boy took to the roads and the wagons like his father, the girl took to the ledgers like her mother, and woe to the carter who padded a bill within her reach. And on winter evenings, when the yard was bedded down and the lamps were burning steady over the arch, the children would beg the story, the way children do who sense a legend in the house, and Marianne told it to them straight, because she had been lied to enough for one lifetime and would not run a house on varnish. She told them about the castle, and the cold, and the 9 years, and the lantern lit for a man who never came, and the night she blew it out, and the letter on the table, and she always ended it the same way, and this is where we end it too. "Do not light your lamp for one man's road," she would say. "Light it for the road itself, for whoever is out in the dark and honest, and the right ones will find their way in, and the wrong ones will ride past, and both of those are the lamp working. Your worth was never in who chooses you. It is in what you keep burning, and whom you keep it burning for. And if a duke on his arm brings home everything but you, let him find the house empty, child, and the wages paid, and the letter waiting. And let the letter be so true that years later he reads it every night like scripture and cannot find one line in it to argue with. That is how you leave. Everything else, the inns and the wagons and the ring and the whole lit length of the North Road, followed from knowing how and when, and that she was worth the leaving. And the lamps above the arch of the 3 lanterns burned every night of her long and honest life. 3 yellow lights in the northern dark, one for the road that brings you, one for the road that takes you, and one that burns whether you come or go at all, because some woman somewhere decided at last that the light was hers.